let's talk about Venus. And I'm not talking about the second planet from the sun, or even the classic rock song by Shocking Blue. No, I'm talking about Sega Project Venus, better known as the Sega Nomad. Now, the Nomad itself was, at its core, just a portable version of Sega's massively popular 16-bit console, the Genesis, or, the Mega Drive for those of you who don't live in Freedom Land. It plays games off of standard cartridges. It has a TV out and can accept wall power, meaning that, in a sense, you can dock the system and can shift between playing your games portably to playing them on your TV. And also, the most common complaint I hear about this system is in regards to its battery life. Now, for those unfamiliar with this obscure Sega console from 1995, I'm sure that these same descriptors could be used to describe the modern console offering from Sega's former biggest competitor. And that, of course, is the Nintendo Switch. When the Switch released in 2017, it was heralded as a potentially revolutionary piece of gaming hardware, being able to be a quote-unquote hybrid console that could either be played on the go or on a TV. But Nintendo was not the first to do this. Sega had beaten them to the punch over 20 years prior. The only major difference between the Sega Nomad and the Nintendo Switch is that Sega's offering had been much less successful. This is Stuff We Play, home of everything weird and retro. Today we're going back in time to the early 1990s. We're going to dive into the story of a company in confusion and what led to this odd hybrid console to be made, and ultimately, we're going to figure out why it failed. Today's video: Sega Project Venus, aka the Sega Nomad. Our story begins in Japan in 1993 with the release of another handheld Sega console, the Sega Mega Jet. This machine was a portable Sega Genesis that was never originally intended to be sold to the public. Instead, the Mega Jet came as part of a deal between Sega Japan, Japan Airlines. JAL was interested in upgrading their in-flight entertainment systems, and had already gone so far as to install LCD TV screens in each seat on each flight. However, along with in-flight movies, JAL also wanted to go a step farther and become one of the first Asian airlines to offer in-flight gaming options. This was a trend that would later become popular with other airlines throughout Asia, most notably with Singapore Airlines, who later had Game Boy games available to play on seatback TVs as part of their Chris World systems. Anyways, JAL probably went with Sega in particular here because, especially in arcades, Sega was known to have some of the best games available at the time. But LCD screens and in-flight entertainment systems were much more primitive than they are today. It was impractical for JAL to just have Genesis games built into each screen. So, instead, Sega created the Mega Jet, a portable system that could be rented by flight passengers along with a select number of games and played throughout the duration of each flight. It required its own power supply and video cables, but it was fairly easy to set up, and JAL offered some massively popular titles to play on it, such as Super Monaco GP2 and Sonic the Hedgehog. And it ends up that the Mega Jet was a bit of a hit for JAL, and by extension, that meant that it was a small success for Sega. The following year in 1994, Sega Japan reached a new deal with Alpine, a company who was making color TV monitors that could be used in cars. As such, the Mega Jet was re-released along with a car-compatible power adapter and a copy of Sonic the Hedgehog 3. And, as they were already making more Mega Jets anyways, Sega Japan decided to do a limited retail release of the system as well. But the Mega Jet was never intended to be any more than that. A version of the Genesis that could be released in limited quantities for specific situations. After all, it wasn't a new console. The Sega Genesis itself had been out on the market since the late 1980s, and though sales were lukewarm in Japan, it was massively popular globally. In fact, by 1994, it was perhaps the most popular video game console on the market in North America. Through a combination of in-your-face marketing, a plethora of unique titles that appealed to a wide range of people, and overall just positioning themselves as the cool underdogs of the video game world, Sega of America was able to dominate the market with their 16-bit Genesis and become the #1 force in the North American gaming market. But by the mid-1990s, things were beginning to change. Though Sega had made a name for themselves by poising themselves as an edgy, attitude-filled company to combat rival Nintendo's family-friendly image, it's hard to position yourself as the cool underdog if you're near the top. And with the success of those at Sega, also came a slew of companies wanting to make a name for themselves in the gaming world. 3DO, Commodore, Fujitsu, these were just some of the companies that, around the world in the mid-90s, began to introduce new 32-bit machines to try to make it big. But they all failed. No major competitor would find success until late in 1994, when Sony introduced the original PlayStation. But early in 1994, Sega of America wasn't concerned with this. At this time, they didn't want more powerful hardware. Even though in 1994 Sega Japan had a new, more powerful console in the works known as Project Saturn, those at Sega of America were more concerned with extending the life of the Genesis. After all, it was selling like hotcakes. This led to the development of new systems and add-ons for the Genesis by Sega of America. One of those would be Project Mars, a 32-bit add-on for the Genesis that would allow it to play more impressive looking titles. This would later be released as a Sega 32X. It would be a massive commercial failure for Sega, but the 32X would be just one of many Genesis-related projects. By 1994, there had been 2 different models of the regular Genesis released, 2 models of a CD-based add-on known as the Sega CD, and even a combination of the 2 units known as the Sega CDX. That's also not to mention the countless cancelled projects, including a combination Genesis 32X unit known as the Sega Neptune. Sega of America at this time was also supporting a handheld system in the form of the 8-bit Sega Game Gear, and also in 1994 released the education-focused Sega Pico console. That's many different pieces of hardware, and to many in the gaming world, it seemed like Sega of America was just throwing everything they could at the wall to see what would stick. To be fair, some of those products had come from Sega Japan. Though Sega of America often acted independently of their head branch, Sega Japan were still the rulers of the Kingdom of Sega, and at this time, Sega of America was increasingly trying to push off releasing Project Saturn in North America. Sega Japan had wanted to completely abandon the Genesis and move on to this new console, due to the poor sales of the Genesis in Japan. But due to the success of the Genesis abroad, those at Sega of America wanted to do just the opposite. They wanted to keep the Genesis alive as long as possible. At the same time, while Sega was dominating the home console market, they were also slumping in the handheld games market. Though Nintendo's Game Boy console was technically unimpressive and could only display games in black and white, its cheap price and plethora of great titles eventually led to over 100 million of them being sold worldwide. That was in comparison to only 11 million Game Gears. As such, sometime in early 1994, a team at Sega of America began working on a new handheld console, called Project Venus. This technologically advanced console was planned to be able to play its own graphically impressive titles, and was even supposed to feature such high-tech features as a touchscreen. But as development went on, the team at SOA also learned that their planned handheld console could cost upwards of $290 at launch. That's in comparison to the Game Boy, which had launched at only $90. At this point, Project Venus's size and scope was drastically changed. It was decided that instead of being a completely new console, Sega instead was going to take inspiration from another of their rivals, NEC. NEC had been responsible for releasing a massively popular system in Japan called the PC Engine. Able to play games on credit card-sized cartridges called HuCards, the PC Engine managed to be a major player in the Japanese games market, even outselling the Genesis in its home country. But in North America, NEC's fortunes had been vastly different. The PC Engine landed stateside in 1989 as a TurboGrafx 16, and it had been a massive failure. By 1994, NEC was essentially a non-player in the North American video game market. Important to this story is a console released by NEC in 1990 known as the Turbo Express. The Turbo Express was just a TurboGrafx shoved into a smaller shell with buttons and a screen attached to it. It played all of the same HuCard games as the home console counterpart, and it also ran off of 6 AA batteries, which it could drain in only about 2 hours. So, Project Venus at this point in mid-1994 shifted to be a Genesis equivalent to the Turbo Express. And, conveniently for those working at Sega of America, their Japanese counterparts already had a mostly portable version of the Genesis out on the market. That, of course, was the Mega Jet. Sega of America's team didn't have to make many alterations to turn the Mega Jet into a true portable Genesis. They squashed the form factor a bit, placed an LCD screen in the middle of it, and kept features in such as the AV out port. From there, all they needed to do was to add in a way for the unit to run off of AA batteries. For this, instead of building in battery slots, SOA's team just added a clip-on battery holder that took 6 AAs. This meant that the system could still run off of wall power without this pack, but in order to use the system portably, this would be the only way to give it power. To Sega of America's quality assurance anyways, it seemed golden. SOA's team had developed a perfectly usable portable Genesis. And as a nice bonus, that estimated launch price had been shaved down from over $290 to a more reasonable but still kind of expensive $180. To test the waters with the new system, Sega of America, after a few delays, would release Project Venus, now known as the Sega Genesis Nomad, in select American cities in October 1995. When initial sales came back positive, they released it nationwide in early 1996. It would go on to be a massive flop, and as such would never see release outside of North America. Now, before we go on with the Nomad story, let's take a look at the unit itself. The Sega Genesis Nomad, or as most people just call it, the Sega Nomad, despite the presence of sharp lines in its design, is actually incredibly comfortable to hold. I mean, sure, it very much so has the length and thickness of a brick, but it is at the very least a rather ergonomic brick. This is aided in part by the system having some subtle curves and some grips to rest your hand on located on the back of it. The buttons themselves are laid out like on a 6-button Genesis controller, but instead of a traditional circular shape, they're all ovular. Combine this with some very reassuring audible feedback that's provided with every press, and you have easily one of the most satisfying ways to control Genesis games. And I can give similar praise to the D-pad as well. It's a concave design that can easily be pushed in 8 directions, and like with the buttons, you get some very reassuring audible feedback whenever you press it in a direction. And as for the screen here, okay, it's completely unimpressive by today's standards, but by the standards of gaming in 1995, it's awesome. Like the Game Gear, the screen here is not only full color, but it's also backlit. And of course, it has some major issues with ghosting, which is especially apparent in fast-paced titles such as Sonic the Hedgehog. But again, by the standards of the time, it's quite good. I mean, just compare this to the Game Boy, which had no front or backlight and was completely in black and white. The visual experience here is completely night and day. But though it can excuse some of the shortcomings of the screen, the Nomad has some other very noticeable flaws. For example, let's look at the built-in speaker here. It's very loud and the volume is very easy to adjust, but it's also only capable of mono sound without plugging it into something. In order to get stereo sound out of a Nomad, you either need to get audio through the headphone jack or through use of the AV out port. And on the subject of the AV out port, despite most Genesis models at the very least supporting S-video, the Nomad is limited to only composite out. And yes, it's a rather clean composite signal, but composite is no S-video, and S-video is no RGB. Something that, by the way, was possible without modding on the Sega Master System, which released all the way back in 1986. Also, we really need to talk about the Nomad's power and reliability issues. Like the Turbo Express, the Sega Nomad runs off of 6 AA batteries. But also like the Turbo Express, it can drain said batteries in about 2 hours. And of course, that's assuming you even have the battery pack for your Nomad. When I received my unit, I was lucky enough to have the battery pack with it, but I think that most nowadays will not be so lucky. And you need the battery pack to play it portably. But then again, as the system is so comfortable and can support 2-player via the controller port and has AV out, perhaps it's better suited as just a fancy alternative to a regular Genesis. Also, like the Game Gear, many Nomad units have capacitors in them that can leak over time. And I am thankful enough to have a unit that has been recapped. If you find a unit, please check to see if it has any capacitor leakage, because many Nomad units nowadays are effectively dead. So I think the final thing I need to touch on here is game compatibility. Most Genesis games will work on a Nomad no problem, even the majority of games released outside of North America. But there are some games that work with regular Genesis consoles that just don't work with it. And on that note, there's also no way to use a Nomad with the Sega 32X or Sega CD without modding. So I guess on that note, who is a Sega Nomad even for? Both in 1995 and today, it's more expensive and harder to find than a stock Genesis, and it can't even play all Genesis games. Also, these units need some TLC to remain reliable, and the screen here is definitely not ideal for more fast-paced titles. But at the same time, it's so comfortable that I can't help but love it. And besides, if you're playing slower paced games such as RPGs such as Phantasy Star, it's fine. Plus, as would later be seen with the Nintendo Switch, the ability to easily switch between playing on a TV or portably is really awesome, and I'm sure that was a big selling point when it was new. But with that said, I think I can see why this thing failed. The Sega Nomad originally released to much acclaim, but despite the portability factor, the Nomad was not destined to be a success. Though it was a technically impressive handheld, many of the issues I mentioned earlier, particularly the battery life, caused many consumers to be skeptical of the system. There is also the issue of the price. At $190, the Nomad, though more powerful than the Game Boy, was also $100 more expensive than it, and it didn't even have a pack-in title. The Game Boy could often be found with games such as Tetris included with it, making it a very obvious, more budget-friendly choice compared to the Nomad. So, the Nomad sold poorly pretty much immediately following its nationwide rollout in 1996. Those sales and test markets had been good, the greater gaming public just did not seem to be interested in it. Sega of America even tried to address some of the bigger issues with the unit, slashing the price to only $100 a few months after launch and even releasing a rechargeable battery pack. But not even that could save the Nomad. By mid-1996, the damage had been done. But what I think truly doomed the Nomad were not any of its own problems, but rather problems with the company that made it. By late 1996, CEO Tom Kalinske had left Sega of America, and Sega Japan had forced them to release the Saturn. And the Saturn had been a flop, along with the 32X, and the CDX, and the Pico, and with the entry of Sony into the video game market and Nintendo's release of their Nintendo 64 console, Sega slipped from being an industry leader to being a battered underdog. And while the Nomad didn't cause these troubles, it certainly hadn't helped. Sega of America had thrown everything at the wall to see what would stick, and after throwing so much, there was, in fact, no way that the Nomad could stick. The final death knell for the system would come with it being quietly discontinued in early 1997, and it would never see release in Europe or Japan. There is no need to release it there. Sega of America had seen the writing on the wall. By 1998, Pokemon Red version, Blue version, and later Pokemon Yellow version had been released for the Game Boy, and they had become the most popular titles for the then over 9-year-old system, and Pokemon itself had become a phenomenon, and at that point, Sega of America saw no reason to keep competing in the handheld console market. As such, they soon discontinued the Game Gear as well. The Sega Nomad had been an impressive piece of technology for its time, but being technically impressive was not enough to sell units. Nintendo's offering won the 90s handheld console war not because it was impressive, because it wasn't. The Game Boy was outdated technology as soon as it was released, but that didn't matter. The Game Boy was cheap, and Nintendo relied not on specs to sell their system, but games. And it just so happened that, to the 90s gaming public, the Game Boy just had better games. You know what? Despite its weird quirks, and despite the fact that it was a huge commercial failure, I love the Sega Nomad. I think that really just comes down to, whether we're talking about Nintendo Switch games or Sega Genesis games, there's just really something nice about being able to play a game on your TV at home, but then also being able to take it on the go. Of course, the Switch accomplishes that much better than the Nomad did. But at the same time, the Switch came out 22 years after the Nomad. I'd be surprised if it didn't do everything better. But also, on that note, I need to give a huge, massive thank you to Robert and Abby Hornibrook, who, like with my Sharp Twin Famicom video I did back in January, made this video possible. This Sega Nomad right here was sent to me by them, and this thing is in just wonderful condition. So with that said, I'd like to go thank some of my awesome patrons from Patreon. Those of course are Justin Chipman, The Golden Bolt, Dylan Ola, and again, Robert and Abby Hornibrook, who directly made this video possible. So thank you very much for watching, stay classy, subscribe to Stuff We Play for more great content like this, and I'll see you next time.